Has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today's national accounts confirm that over the last quarter, Australia's economic growth rate has gone down and living standards have fallen. Growth in household consumption is now the weakest it's been in more than 5 years. And over the last year, corporate profits have grown 6 times faster than wages. Doesn't this just prove that while this government is busy fighting itself, everything is going up except people's wages?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, one thing's for certain. We on this side of the House won't talk down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. We won't talk down the Australian economy. And that's because today's national accounts reveal that the Australian economy is still growing strongly. At 2.8%, it's faster than the OECD average and faster than any G7 country except the United States, Mr Speaker. And that's our economic record. Over 1.1 million new jobs have been created. We're one of only 10 nations in the world to have a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. Unemployment has come down to 5%, the lowest level since 2012, and as the Prime Minister has pointed out numerous times to this chamber, over 100,000 young people have got a job over the last financial year, Mr Speaker. That is our record. Compared to those opposite, when they were in government, debt was rising, unemployment was rising, Mr Speaker, and they had no plans for the economy of Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, let me just remind the House of a few numbers. Today's national accounts has revealed that GDP growth is 2.8%. What was it when Labor was last in office in September 2013 when we came to government? 2.1%, Mr Speaker. GDP per capita growth averaged just 0.5% in Labor's last year in office, Mr Speaker. What is GDP per capita growth today, Mr Speaker? It was 0.5% when Labor was in office. Today it's 1.2%, Mr Speaker. Compensation of employees, Mr Speaker, is now 4.3%. What was it in Labor's last year in office, Mr Speaker? 3.2%, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it doesn't matter which economic data, which indicator you look at today. We are doing better than Labor ever did, Mr Speaker. We are growing the economy. We're creating more jobs. We've seen our AAA credit rating reaffirmed, and next year we will deliver the first budget surplus in more than a decade.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table a document.
I am. I just want to table a document that shows that corporate profits are up 6 times wages in this country.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Boothby. Member for Boothby has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is protecting the standard of living of Australians and securing their future opportunities by making Australia even stronger?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She asked me about protecting the standards of living of Australians and it's securing future opportunities. And the way we are doing that is we're running a strong economy. And we have been, Mr Speaker, from the day we came into office, from that day to now, more than 1.1 million jobs created. In the last 12 months, over 100,000 young people got a job, the strongest growth in youth employment in Australia's economic history. Unemployment coming down to 5%, 50,000 fewer people unemployed than at the last election, the lowest level of welfare dependency of working-age population in more than 25 years. That's the economy we're running, but today's national account shows that nominal GDP growth was 5.2% through the year. Now that's above the 4.5% forecast that was assumption that was under the most recent budget for 17-18, and this current year the forecast was 3.75. So the nominal growth outcome, which is running already in this first quarter of the year, is running ahead of what the budget was projecting for this year, and that means that our budget is on track, and that means on the 2nd of April next year, this government, our government, will bring down the first surplus budget in more than a decade because we know how to run a strong economy. And the fact that we can bring the budget back into surplus means that we're able to increase funding for schools by $37.6 billion, Mr Speaker. Per student funding up on average by 62%. That's what you can do when you get the budget back in balance, when you can get the economy running in the right direction. It enables you to put $75 billion of a rolling program into infrastructure, including over $500 million in important water infrastructure, which is giving us resilience against droughts into the future. And it enables you to do $144 billion worth of personal income tax cuts legislated by this government that were put in this year's budget that were opposed by the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, and if they were elected, they would wipe out half of those tax cuts for hard-working Australians. But on top of that, Mr Speaker, on top of that, it enables us to keep Australians safe. And this morning I announced in this financial year alone that we're putting $26 million extra to ensure we're providing critical emergency capabilities, especially in relation to bushfires. So we can get greater capabilities out of the big jets, Mr Speaker, so we can increase the warnings programs and the communications devices that are there to assist people in the middle of critical bushfires. And we know that as we go into this bushfire season, it'll be one of the most difficult and one of the most hazardous for the Australian population. So when you run a strong economy, you can pay for the things that Australians rely on. You can give them that absolute guarantee that a strong economy delivers.
The member for Hinkler.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how a strong economy enables investment in the services regional Australians rely on, and how would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this investment at risk?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for Hinkler for his question. Alert as usual, Mr Speaker, unlike those opposite, completely moribund, completely unaware of what's going on, Mr Speaker. And next year, the Liberals and Nationals government, well, we're delivering a surplus. Right here, on this spot, April 2, watch the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, deliver a budget surplus. And how good will that be? The kind of surplus budget those opposite could only dream about. They're very envious, they're very green about this, Mr Speaker. The member for Melbourne, well, he's just green all the time, but they have their policies, Mr Speaker, which are trying to appease green votes in the cities. Meanwhile, we're getting on with the job of building a better Australia to make sure that we can produce budget surpluses. Now, this means we can deliver the essential services that Australians rely on, essential services such as the historic agreement, the historic regional deal for Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. Now, this is transformative. This is deserved. Regional deal, this is going to be sensational for Bundaberg, the Fraser Coast, and the member for Hinkler has fought hard for this, and as usual, he has delivered. He fought hard, he delivered, and like existing city deals, this regional deal will bring together all levels of government, all three tiers, local, state and federal, coming together to make sure that we get the sorts of regional services that Australians deserve and expect. It's a unique opportunity to get those three tiers of government together, and this deal will attract new businesses. This deal will create jobs. I know the member for Hinkler is passionate about creating job opportunities in his electorate, just like we all are on this side of the House, and that's why we've helped small and medium enterprises create more than 1 million jobs in 5 years. And you heard the Prime Minister a little while ago talk about the 100,000 jobs for young people in the last financial year. Now, jobs like the 1 million jobs that we've partnered with, it's helping Hinkler, it's helping Central and North Queensland, indeed it's helping all Queensland. Jobs in construction, thanks to our $10 billion investment in the Bruce Highway. Jobs in tourism, and we've supported that through the Regional Growth Fund, through Bundaberg Brewed Drinks Super Brewery. The Liberals and Nationals have Hinkler's back. We've got the back of Queensland. Now, the Mayor of Fraser Coast Council, George Seymour, fully on board with it. You should listen to this. He says the Fraser Coast Regional Council is grateful for the opportunity provided by the regional deal and excited about what this will mean for the opportunity. He knows, just like the member for Hinkler, it's going to create jobs, it's going to create opportunities. It will mean a better, a stronger and improved Bundaberg-Hervey Bay region. But none of this is possible. None of this is possible without a strong economy, without good management and without making the decisions that regional people need to deliver the services and infrastructure that they deserve. Now, all Labor stands for is 5 new taxes on your income, on your business, on your property, on your savings, and we all know on your electricity bill. That's right, on your electricity bill. That's all Labor stands for, higher taxes, less jobs.
Concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime
Deputy
Minister.
Leader, members on my right. The Leader of the House. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Business Council of Australia, which today said about the government's discredited forced divestment policy, and I quote, "It is surprising to see this legislation proposed by a Liberal government. This is the kind of intrusive, heavy-handed intervention into the market you would expect from the Greens. Bad policy created this mess, and ill-conceived and rushed policy won't achieve what is desperately needed, lower electricity bills for families and businesses."
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party spends most of their time saying that we are the champions of big businesses, Mr Speaker. Well, I'll tell you who is sitting in bed with big businesses that want to rip off Australian customers on their electricity prices. The Labor Party. That's who it is. That's who it is. I agree with the Business Council on this matter, though. On this matter, I agree with them when the Business Council of Australia said that the emissions target of 26% is appropriate and achievable, but a 45% emissions reduction target is an economy-wrecking target, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party are proposing. So not only do they want to cuddle up to the big energy companies and not take the sides of customers like the Liberal Party and the National Party is, but they also want to hit customers with a 45%, what is effectively an electricity tax that will put up electricity prices for mums and for dads and for small businesses and pensioners and older Australians. That's the Labor Party's view. The member for Barker reminded us this week that when Robert Menzies said that we stand up for the forgotten people, that didn't mean forgotten energy company executives, Mr Speaker. It meant mums and dads and people paying electricity prices. Mr Speaker, that's who we're fighting for. In the Liberal and the National Party, we're fighting for small businesses who are out there working hard. We're fighting for family businesses. We're fighting for people who go out there and earn a wage and pay tax. We're fighting for people who haven't got the time, Mr Speaker, to go out there and be advocates all the time and be political activists. That is the party of the Labor Party and the Greens and the left. They want to fill the airwaves. They want to fill their airways with economy-wrecking policies. But what we're doing on this side is standing up for Australians who work hard and are sick of paying too much for their electricity bills. We're prepared to take on the big energy companies. The Labor Party has folded.
The member for Melbourne.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy. Young people across Australia, and again today here in our parliament, are demanding your government take action on climate change and listen to the world's climate scientists. But instead, you're proposing to use public money to underwrite and indemnify coal-fired power stations, which could leave taxpayers exposed to huge liabilities. Minister, to the nearest $1 billion, what is the potential exposure of the taxpayer if over summer you underwrite coal-fired power stations or indemnify them against future carbon risk? Will you now drop your fiscally irresponsible crusade to prop up coal-fired power stations, or will you leave it to this power-sharing parliament to pass my bill to prevent your economic recklessness?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Thank you for the dictionary.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and of course we are seeing over the next 2.5 years an investment of $15 billion. $15 billion committed to a new generation in the electricity sector, and that will see a 250% increase in the solar and wind in our sector, from 9% of generation up to 23% of generation in the next 2.5 years. But, Mr Speaker, this, whilst ensuring that we will get emissions down, below 26% by the early 2020s, we will get to 26% by the early 2020s. The challenge it creates is we need to have enough dispatchable 24/7 power in the system to keep the lights on, and keep prices down. And that's why, Mr Speaker, we are underwriting new generation, new supply to make sure those prices come down. Now, Mr Speaker, we are also taking on the big energy companies. We're taking on the big energy companies, and we're doing that because we have seen dodgy practices, we have seen manipulation, we have seen price gouging from those in the energy sector that are more interested in the bottom line than the interests of customers. And those opposite have a big decision to make. Whose side do they sit on? Do they sit on the side of the hard-working small businesses and families of Australia, or do they sit on the side—
The Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, my question was about the level of exposure, and if he doesn't know that, doesn't know whether emissions are going up or down, he should just say so.
Melbourne. Member for Melbourne will resume his seat. If I haven't called the minister yet, the member— I haven't called you. No, I haven't called you. The minister will resume his seat. I haven't called you. Members can cease interjecting. I said to the minister, I haven't called you. I need to rule on the point of order. Members on my left, the member for Melbourne— I want to rule on the member for Melbourne's point of order. His question had a long preamble and at least 3 questions in it, so it's not in order to raise a point of order and seek the minister to answer one single part of it. If he wants the minister to be contained in his answer to a specific area, he needs to make sure that the question is specific to that point. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The real question here is which side of the table do those sit on, those opposite? Do they sit on the side of the table of the hard-working small businesses and families of Australia, or do they sit on the side of the big energy companies? Well, we sit with those hard-working small businesses and families across Australia.
Just before I call the member for Fairfax, the member for Hunter— just contain himself for a second. I'd like to inform the House that we have joining us in the front row of the gallery this afternoon the winners of the My First Speech competition that the Department of the House runs. We'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. And I call the member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how a strong economy allows the government to deliver services and lower costs of living for all Australians, including those in my electorate of Fairfax? And, Treasurer, how would a weaker economy, through higher taxes, put these outcomes at risk?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question, because he is committed, like we are on this side of the House, to growing the economy, to creating more jobs, to bringing the budget back to surplus without increasing taxes, Mr Speaker. That is what we have done in creating new jobs and in growing the economy, and next year we'll bring the budget back into surplus. Now, that's good news for more than 21,000 small businesses across the electorate of Fairfax. And what we won't do is slug the hard-working people of Fairfax, like the more than 8,000 people in his electorate who use negative gearing with the new tax, Mr Speaker, more than 250,000 across Queensland. What we won't do is slug more than the 7,000 people in his electorate of Fairfax who currently are getting the benefits of franking credits, like the Labor Party will with their retirees tax, Mr Speaker. Now, today's national accounts saw the Australian economy continue to perform strongly. 2.8% GDP growth sees Australia's economy growing faster than the OECD average and growing faster than any G7 country except the United States, Mr Speaker. We've seen our AAA credit rating reaffirmed. We've seen unemployment come down to 5%. We've seen more than 1 million new jobs being created. We recently saw the wages price index increase by 2.3%, which is the biggest jump in 3 years, Mr Speaker. And the Reserve Bank Governor has said they'll continue to see a pickup in wages growth, and this will be a welcome development. And the benefit of a strong economy is the record spending on health and education that is occurring on our watch, Mr Speaker. Now, opposite, they want to tax you from the cradle to the grave. And the most pernicious of taxes is the retirees' tax, including in the member for McMahon's electorate. Around 3,000 people will be affected, like Senka, who said that she and her husband have worked for 30 years. We've saved, we've scrimped, we've sacrificed to be self-sufficient financially and not be a burden on the welfare system. And they cannot believe what Labor is doing and now being proposed by their own shadow treasurer. Alan, in the Labor electorate of Richmond, will lose over $2,500 a year or $50 a week. Now, Alan wrote to the shadow treasurer and said of his response it was offensive and deliberately misleading, Mr Speaker. That is what a member, a constituent in the electorate of Richmond said, Mr Speaker. And Jack from the electorate of Jagga Jagga, who said he works in a working-class suburb, whose wife is a nurse, he was a draftsman and will stand to lose significantly under Labor's policy. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we will grow the economy, we'll create new jobs and we will lower taxes, a stark contrast to those opposite.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm reports this morning that the member for Curtin told the government that its discredited forced divestment policy threatened investment, could be regarded as sovereign risk and was inconsistent with Liberal values?
The Treasurer has the call.
I can confirm to the member for McMahon that we, on this side of the House, have introduced legislation today to reduce people's power prices, Mr Speaker, to reduce people's power prices, because we are on the side of the Australian consumer, the families and the small businesses. Now, as the member for McMahon knows, that the ACCC has identified significant problems in the energy market, which they say is unsustainable and can't continue in its current form. Those problems are in the retail market, where retailers don't pass on to consumers the full benefit of reductions in their own costs, Mr Speaker. There are problems in the contract market. We're seeing it particularly in South Australia, illiquidity in the contract market, where new retailers can't come into the market because of a barrier to entry, because they can't get the hedges and swaps and the financial contracts that they need. And we see it in the wholesale market as well, Mr Speaker, where big generators have sometimes held back supply in order to send prices up. Now, we say to the member for McMahon, what's wrong with calling out that misconduct, Mr Speaker? What's wrong with putting in place penalties, which range from infringement notices and higher fines, and in the case of the wholesale market, to divestment, Mr Speaker, and divestment on the recommendation of the ACCC to the Treasurer, and the Treasurer on a referral to the Federal Court of Australia, Mr Speaker. And I say to the member for McMahon, what is wrong with Australia having a policy of divestment as the United States and the United Kingdom does, Mr Speaker? What's so different? What's so different? And I'll tell you what's different. The Labor Party have a set of tax policies and an industrial relation policy which is big anti-business, Mr Speaker, big-time anti-business. And they are looking for a cover to cosy up with the energy companies to obscure the failures of their own policies, Mr Speaker. So I can tell the House that we in the Liberal and National parties are committed to lowering people's power bills. We've seen prices come down from July this year in Queensland, South Australia and in New South Wales, and we will take whatever action is needed, including introducing this bill in the House today, to ensure that the people of Australia, all 25 million of them, get a better deal from the energy companies.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney update the House on steps that the government is taking to strengthen national security and protect Australians? Is the Attorney aware of any alternative approaches?
Attorney-General has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question, and as the member is well aware, the Prime Minister made it an absolute priority this
week to reach agreement on the encryption assistance legislation and have that legislation move through the House. That will, by agreement, ultimately be a milestone achievement for this government and to the enormous benefit of the people that it will protect. You asked about two or alternative versions of this legislation. Two issues came to be large sticking points towards the end of the negotiations. One was whether or not you should keep in or remove state and territory police forces, and the other was how narrowly or how broadly you might characterise the offences that would allow these very important powers to be used. Fortunately, the bill that will ultimately pass the parliament this week will include state and territory police forces and have a sufficiently broad range of offences that allow these powers to be used. This is an opportunity to inform the House as to why those two ultimate determinations, which this government stood fast on, are utterly critical. The two reasons are that, unfortunately, it's the case that terrorism and other related offences do not occur in isolation. We've seen previously examples like Khalid Sharoof, who both was a terrorist but before that dealt in drugs and committed drug offences. We've seen examples such as Omar Sakaria, who was arrested on terrorism charges in Brisbane in 2014, was subsequently convicted of those charges and has also been convicted of extortion. These very, very serious offences often act in composite and they converge on each other, and investigating the broader series of offences at both a Commonwealth and a state level helps us put more serious criminals in jail and helps us detect, uncover and prosecute terrorism. Had the offences been cast too broadly, as was advocated by members opposite, and left only to terrorism and child sex offences, the types of things that we would not have assistance in detecting, investigating and prosecuting would have been things like drug offences, money laundering, bribery and corruption, fraud and organised criminal organisations, murder and cybercrime. These, with the bill that will go through this parliament, will now be able to be investigated with the assistance of the encryption assistance legislation. And there have been a number of notable examples of the types of offences that have been very substantially hampered in their investigation. If I can just briefly raise two. In August 2017, the AFP, with the assistance of authorities in Dubai and the Netherlands, arrested 17 people and seized over 1.9 tonnes of MDMA, cocaine and ice, and that investigation, whilst ultimately successful, was severely hampered by the use of encryption technology. In 2017, the AFP uncovered 30 kilograms of heroin into Fiji and 600 into cocaine into Haiti, and again encryption was at the heart of.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the now independent member for Chisholm that the government's discredited forced divestment policy is, and I quote, totally counter to Liberal values of free enterprise and small government, and will be a deterrent for future investment and won't lower electricity prices but will actually have the reverse effect?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Liberal Party members in this chamber, want to see electricity prices come down, and we're going to side with the customers who have been paying too much and have been taken advantage of by big electricity companies, and that's what our bill is designed to achieve. And that's why we're taking action, because we want to stand by the families and small businesses and family businesses of Australia who are paying too much. And the Treasurer posed a question a little before. Why would the Labor Party not want there to be a power to take action against price gouging and the sorts of conduct that would be anti-competitive and that could lead to an increase in prices which flows through to end consumers? Why would you be opposed to a power that would help even up the score for mums and dads and pensioners? Now, we're not confused about that. We're quite certain about it. We know who we stand for. We stand for mums and dads and small and family businesses who are looking for a better deal from energy companies.
The member for Port Adelaide on a point of order.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. 1 minute in, the Prime Minister still hasn't mentioned the member for Chisholm, and I ask him to be directly relevant.
The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister's concluded. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister update the House how a strong economy enables the government to provide support for women in family and small business to succeed? How would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this support at risk?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the member for Robertson for her question. And she, like every member on this side of the chamber, understands how vital it is that we support small and family-sized businesses because they employ more than 7 million Australians. She understands that a third of all small business operators are in fact women, and we want to see even more women get into small and family-sized businesses, so we are supporting them to be able to do just that. We know that when women do well, their families do well, and our economy and our nation prospers. And that is why we delivered the Women's Economic Security Statement, the very first time that any government has delivered an economic security statement helping women to be able to build their financial security. And it is exactly why we are helping women who are running small and family-sized businesses with changes to our parental leave payment. We are changing it so that it is a lot more flexible, because we know that the current system is far too rigid. We know that there are many small and family-sized business operators that simply cannot spend 18 weeks away from their business. So we've done something about it. And as we've heard from people like Tess McCabe, a small business owner who spoke to the Sydney Morning Herald, she said that she was so pleased when she heard the news about the government's announcement that she cried. She put it was exactly what self-employed people want, the choice to take those blocks of paid parental leave in a way that suits them. And that is what we are about. We are about giving people flexibility and choice. We are not about raising their taxes, which is exactly what those opposite would do. For somebody like Tess McCabe, who's got a small or family business, we're in fact doing the opposite. We're cutting her taxes, because anybody who has got a business with a turnover of less than $50 million under our government has seen the company tax rate go down from 30 cents in the dollar down to 25 cents in the dollar with our legislated plan. Because, unlike those opposite, we know how to manage a budget. We know it is important that you don't raise taxes on people's businesses, on their investments, on their retirement savings, on their homes, on their superannuation. That doesn't help small and family-sized businesses, and it certainly doesn't help them when you've got retirees being slugged with a mega retiree tax. We know that the $200 billion worth of new or increased taxes that those opposite would impose would hurt small and family-sized businesses. We want to help them, not hurt them, which is why we say don't vote Labor.
The member for Greenway has the call.
I wouldn't expect you to say vote for us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Greenway has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that, according to today's media reports, energy companies, business groups and even government members are warning that the Prime Minister's discredited forced divestment policy sets a dangerous precedent that will threaten investment across the economy? Does the Prime Minister agree?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker. I don't support that. Mr. Speaker, what the ACCC Retail Electricity Pricing Inquiry final report found, I initiated that report, Mr. Speaker, as Treasurer. We've been taking action on electricity prices. We haven't been doing things to force them up like the Labor Party would do. They found that retailers taking advantage of confused and disengaged customers. They found competition being restricted through dominant players choosing not to offer financial contracts and conduct which undermines the effective operation of the wholesale market. Mr. Speaker, that's the misconduct, that's the practices which they found, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite says, what did they say about divestment? It's a very good point. The ACCC did not recommend divestment. What they recommended, Mr. Speaker, was that if you could do everything you possibly could, then it wouldn't be necessary. But those options aren't available, Mr. Speaker, and our government has taken the decision, and it was also taken under the previous Prime Minister, that we would introduce divestment powers to ensure that big electricity companies did not take advantage of Australian consumers. Now, it's pretty simple. You're either with the top end of town over there on big electricity companies, or you're standing with the government who wants to put in place and even up in the national laws to ensure that those big electricity companies cannot play the market and cannot play mums and dads who are paying too much for their electricity prices. Now, I know why Labor probably don't want to support this measure, because they're for higher electricity prices. How do I know that? Because they have a 45% emissions reduction target which will drive up prices. They like higher prices. When they were in government, they drove up prices. They doubled, Mr Speaker, despite the fact that I understand they gave $1 billion to brown coal generation, Mr Speaker, and all the energy generators had to do was send them their bank account details for those opposite when they were in government. So, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to take lectures from the Labor Party, who has only one agenda, and that is to punish mums and dads and pensioners and small businesses with higher electricity prices as they cuddle up to the big energy companies.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the minister update the House on how a strong economy enables government to embark on record spending in defence, creating a sovereign defence capability? How would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this investment at risk?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left.
The member for Fisher is a great advocate for defence industry in his electorate, particularly a company called Heli Mods, which gets a great deal of attention from the member for Fisher. But he's also using the heft of the government spending on defence to help grow the economy in Fisher, in his electorate, on the Sunshine Coast, and he should be commended for it, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, because we are running a surplus budget, because we are building a strong economy, we can invest in the essential services and priorities that the Australian public regard as important without increasing taxes. In stark contrast to the Labor Party, who only think that you can only increase spending and keep increasing taxes. What this government has done, Mr Speaker, and this year in particular, has been a very busy year for defence and for defence industry. What we have done is increase spending in defence, building our military capability, the largest in our peacetime history, without increasing taxes. We're using that heft to drive our defence industry boom in this country, Mr Speaker. And I welcome the Minister for Defence Industry to the chamber. He's doing an absolutely sensational
Members on
job.
my left.
He's doing an absolutely sensational job. Under the Minister for Defence Industry,
the Minister will pause for a second. The Minister will pause for a second. Members on my left, you're not going to continue to interject. Okay? If you think you've made a joke once, don't make it 10 times. Let's move on. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, under the Minister for Defence Industry, we wrote $3 billion worth of export permits in the September quarter, one of the highest ever, and applications for defence export permits jumped by 25% of the June quarter. So Labor think it's all very funny, Mr Speaker, but those people who've got their jobs in the defence industry and the servicemen and women of Australia who serve in our defence force, who put on the uniform, they don't think it's very funny. They think it's amazing that they're getting the equipment and the platforms they need to win in theatres of war, keeping them safe and bringing them home. So we don't think it's funny on this side of the House. We see it as a tremendous opportunity to drive a defence industry. And this year, Mr Speaker, we've begun construction on the offshore patrol vessels. We've handed over the first of the Pacific patrol boats to Papua New Guinea. We've begun construction of the Combat Reconnaissance Vehicle factory in Brisbane in the last month, opened by the Minister for Defence Industry, in fact, Mr Speaker. We've begun the construction of the Osborne South Shipyard in June this year. We will soon turn a sod on the Osborne North submarine yard, investing in shipbuilding in a way that Labor could only dream about. In fact, under Labor, they cut spending on defence by 17.9% in real terms, putting our service and men and women at risk.
The Leader of the Opposition has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Courier Mail reports that the Morrison government is threatening Queenslanders with the forced privatisation of their state-owned power assets, with the Energy Minister saying they are on notice. Why does the Prime Minister support the privatisation of power assets, which leads to higher power prices? Why is he threatening Queenslanders with more privatisation and higher power prices?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, as is his habit, the Leader of the Labor Party is just not telling the truth. He's not telling the truth. But one truth he can point to, though, is that the Queensland electricity industry is owned by the Queensland government. So as the Queensland government has been dividend stripping out of the Queensland electricity industry to prop up their financial mismanagement, you know who's been paying for it? Queenslanders, Mr Speaker. Why are power prices higher in Queensland for Queenslanders? Why have they been paying higher prices? Because the Queensland government is gouging them, Mr Speaker. They are the ones who are responsible, who are overseeing the increases of power prices in Queensland. And, Mr Speaker, it is because of a Queensland Labor government that doesn't know how to manage money, and so what they've been doing is jacking up power prices to strip that money away from mums and dads and pensioners and small businesses and family businesses. So if the Leader of the Labor Party wants to come into this House and talk about the ownership of electricity assets in Queensland, he must take responsibility as the Leader of the Labor Party for having a partnership with a Queensland Labor government that's happy to rip off electricity customers and put the money in their own failed budgets.
The member for Dunkley.
My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House how a strong economy enables the government to subsidise new treatments for Australian patients living with leukaemia, like Fiona in Seaford in my electorate of Dunkley? How would a weaker economy through higher taxes put these subsidies at risk?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Dunkley, who has been a great advocate for patients such as Fiona. Fiona has been battling chronic myeloid leukemia. She's been supported under the PBS with medicines which would otherwise cost over $60,000 a year. We heard yesterday he's also been a great advocate for patients such as Ali Clark and Spinraza, where she's been supported under the PBS with her spinal muscular atrophy battle with extraordinary steps forward. But also he's been advocating for patients right across the spectrum in relation to new medicines. And on Friday I was fortunate to meet with Jeff Carson. Now, Jeff Carson is a 70-year-old former engineer. He worked with CSIRO for over 30 years. He's been battling acute myeloid leukemia. It's a condition, obviously, which can have catastrophic impacts. It's a cancer of the blood and a cancer of the bone marrow. And in particular, he has been given early access to Rydart. Rydart is a medicine which we have now made available, as of Saturday, under the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. This medicine will help 200 patients, and it is potentially life-saving or life-changing. It's a medicine which goes to the very heart of what this parliament aspires to achieve through a strong economy and through compassion and through action, all being brought together. The PBS, in that respect, represents the very best of what this parliament can achieve when we put the country in a position where it's able to pay for those actions. In particular, Jeff was excited and delighted that other patients would have access to that which is helping him with his journey and his battle and his life. And whether it was pancreatic cancer or neuroendocrine tumours, which were also supported with other medicines, these are the types of things which we were able to support. And I am pleased and proud and determined about the fact that this government has made the commitment that if the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee recommends it, we will list the medicines that they bring forward. That is our commitment. We know, though, that it can only be done with a strong economy. We know that that has not always been the case, sadly, that in 2011—
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, in terms of your role with the dignity of the House, I just want to draw attention to, if this answer goes to the point of claiming that only one side of politics is concerned about people with leukaemia and only one side would make decisions in favour of leukaemia drugs, and it has happened before.
Manager of Opposition Business.
I am giving the minister a chance to not go there.
The minister will pause for a second. The member for Bruce is warned. I haven't called the minister yet. We're just going to calm down for a second. The Manager of Opposition Business, that was really— I understand the point he's seeking to make, but I'm here to judge things, and I understand he's trying to be helpful from his point of view. But we can't have a situation where people rise to the dispatch box because they're worried about something they think might be said. Okay. The minister now has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. That is not a claim I would make. This is a matter that matters to everybody. But the important thing is these things can only ever be achieved when a country is in a position to fund, to support, to commit and to pay for these most important medicines. And that's what we say proudly we've done and we will continue to do.
Members on my left, in fact on my right as well, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to his previous answer. Doesn't his answer mean that his government is seeking the power to privatise electricity assets in Tasmania, Queensland, Western Australia and Snowy Hydro? And if it doesn't, what exactly does divestiture mean for publicly owned electricity assets?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I refer the Leader of the Labor Party to the statement issued by the Treasurer and the Minister for Energy, and where it says very plainly on the second page, the legislation will apply to government-owned enterprises. In such cases, any divestiture may be made to another government-owned energy company where the two entities genuinely compete with one another. So it has nothing to do with privatisation. But given you asked in relation to my previous answer, and I made reference to the Queensland government retail electricity companies, he may be interested to know, Mr Speaker, that Queensland government-owned electricity retailers made $1.9 billion in profits in 2017, up 45% on 2016. Talk about putting your hands in the pockets of hard-working Australians.
Members on my right.
With government-driven higher electricity prices.
The member for
out of the Queensland
Treasurer.
Labor government. Mr Speaker, the height of Labor, when their cousins up there in Queensland and the state government, Mr Speaker, are smacking Queensland retail customers in the electricity market around the head on a daily basis. They should be joining us, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party, and standing up to anyone who would want to gouge Australians, do the wrong thing by Australians, Mr Speaker. I remember it was the same thing from the Labor Party when it came to dealing with Section 46, Mr Speaker, of the Consumer and Competition Act, when our government stood up for small business to level the playing field to ensure that small businesses got a fair go. And you know who voted against them? The Labor Party, Mr Speaker. It reminds me of when our government stood up and said we're going to make multinationals pay their fair share of tax. You know who voted against that, Mr Speaker? The Labor Party voted against that. On this side, we're happy to stand up to anyone who wants to play the Australian people for mugs, and that includes the Leader of the Labor Party.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please update the House on how a stronger economy enables the government to support science and technology industries? And Minister, What would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this investment at risk?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for her question. CSIRO has 2 sites in her electorate of Ryan, undertaking a wide range of research in a number of areas, including in hydrogen energy, agriculture, robotics and automation. And she, like all those on this side of the House, values the unique science and technology capabilities of Australia. And we've demonstrated our commitment to science and technology. And, Mr Speaker, we can support science because the Liberal National Government has built a strong economy. Now, in the budget this year, we invested $2.4 billion in Australia's research, science and technology capabilities. As part of that, we invested $1.9 billion in long-term research infrastructure. And we did that because we talked to the sector, we listened to the sector and we understood what their needs were in terms of surety of long-term research infrastructure. We invested $41 million to establish the Australian Space Agency, and projections are that that agency will triple the size of the sector and add another $12 billion to our economy by 2030. It will also create an additional 20,000 new jobs. And, Mr Speaker, we invested $4.5 million to improve gender equity in science, technology, engineering and maths. And let me remind the House that the Liberal National Government has invested $1.5 billion more in science agencies than Labor did. Now, this includes $97 million more for CSIRO, $126 million more for ANSTO, $53 million more for the Australian Institute of Marine Science. But, Mr Speaker, not only does the Liberal National Government value Australia's science sector, we value the relationship between science and business, particularly with small and medium enterprises. And that's why in October I released the Statement of Principles for Innovation Precincts. Those principles were developed in conjunction with a number of our key stakeholders, including universities, including state and territory governments, and those will actually establish some very good principles for innovation precincts. And we know that innovation precincts are important to growing Australia's economy. Now, ANSTO, one of our leading agencies, has established a new innovation precinct, and that will connect Australian industry with some of our nation's best and brightest scientists and engineers. Mr Speaker, that will drive our innovation capability, it will drive our employment and it will ensure our economic growth into the future.
Yes, time has concluded. The member for Hotham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Assistant Treasurer. The Assistant Treasurer is responsible for financial services, including the big banks. Since becoming Assistant Treasurer, how many victims of financial misconduct has he met with? Or does the Assistant Treasurer only share his ministerial assessments with LNP donors? And will he now cancel his attendance at the event advertised for 19 December?
Once again, I say to the if the Prime Minister on a point of order, sure. Or the Leader of the House. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, it's the same point of order that I made yesterday. The Minister is not responsible for the banks. That is the responsibility of the Treasurer.
The Leader of the House will pause. The member for Hotham's warned. I've made very clear I'm going to hear points of order without interruption. She's lucky she's still in the chamber to hear the answer, if there is one. The Leader of the House.
Also not responsible for the Royal Commission. The Treasurer is responsible for that as well. So in the same way as the question yesterday was out of order, I think the question today is out of order.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The Assistant Treasurer is responsible for financial services, which certainly do affect the banks. The question as to whether he's been meeting with victims and who he meets with, I would suggest is entirely in order for any minister to be asked whether they've met with particular people. And the question goes through different categories of those people. It starts with victims of misconduct and then asks about LNP donors, whether he meets with those, and then asks about his diary and a future event that he's been advertised to attend.
Yeah, so let's start and work backwards. The Manager of Opposition Business won't be surprised to know the last part of the question is completely out of order, asking ministers things that aren't their responsibility, whether they're attending a fundraiser or they're going through their diary. It's completely out of order. I made that point yesterday, and I'm not going to allow questions to wilfully keep restating it so that I then have to make exactly the same point of order. So that is completely out of order. And when it comes to the part about whether he's met with bank victims from the Royal Commission, he's not responsible for the Royal Commission. He's not. The only part of the question that may well be in order is his responsibilities as Assistant Treasurer with respect to financial services. But even in that case, I make the point that as the Assistant Treasurer, he's not the Primary Minister. That in fact is the Treasurer, who has overall responsibilities. Now, if someone wants to tell me I'm wrong on any of that, I'm happy to hear. Well, there's one point I'm very certain of from all the time I've been in this place, and that is Assistant Treasurers are subordinate to Treasurers. Sorry, Assistant Treasurer, but they are. Yeah. Yes, the Manager of Opposition Business.
The only thing to clarify is the question was framed specifically to victims of financial misconduct, not with reference to the Royal Commission.
Yeah, I think there's so much of it that's out of order. I'm going to rule that out of order and allow you a chance to try and redraft it. I'll call the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. Will the minister update the House how a strong economy ensures the government can take action to lower power prices, including for those in my electorate of Bennelong? How would a weaker economy, through higher taxes, put this action at risk?
The member for Bennelong has asked the question. Sorry, the Minister for Energy. Yeah, that's all right.
Thank you.
My fault.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. And he knows that this government has a balanced and sensible policy for affordable, 24/7 reliable power for Australian families and small businesses, including in his electorate of Bennelong, Mr Speaker. Now, during a recent visit to Bennelong, I met with a number of business owners, including Fletcher's. Fletcher's are a building products company, a manufacturer who employs over 5,500 people. And, Mr Speaker, they know that high energy prices restrict investment and growth, and that's why we're driving energy prices, electricity prices down, Mr Speaker. So businesses like Fletcher Building can employ more Australians, building on more than 1 million jobs, that have been created in the time that we've been in government. And, Mr Speaker, our plan for lower power prices is already delivering results. We've said time and time again that the big energy companies must put their customers first. And thanks to pressure from this government, 500,000 Australian families and small businesses will benefit from lower prices from January 1. AGL, Energy Australia, Origin, Alinta, along with other retailers, are cutting prices for customers by up to 15%. And on average, those customers in New South Wales will be $200 better off, Victoria $313, South Australia $270, South East Queensland more than $175. Prices are coming down, Mr Speaker, but for too long the big energy companies have focused on their profits and not their customers. And that's why this government is introducing our big stick legislation to Parliament, which will hold big energy companies to account, Mr Speaker. Our legislation, our reforms, will crack down on dodgy practices, on price gouging and on loyalty taxes, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House we remember that the Hazelwood Power Station closed in March 2017, and the ACCC found that AGL increased bids from $30 a megawatt-hour to over $60 a megawatt-hour or higher in response. Origin increased bids by up to $150 a megawatt-hour in response to that. Now, this is a test for Labor. Support our legislation and stop the exploitation of hard-working Australians who are paying too much for this essential service, or oppose it and continue to side with the big energy companies. Well, Mr Speaker, we know which side we're on. We're on the side of those hard-working small businesses and Australian families who want a better deal from their energy companies.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer. Today's media reports that the Assistant Treasurer is announcing a review of the ability of health supplement companies to label their products as made in Australia. Given the Assistant Treasurer has a financial interest in a health supplements company named RQ Supplements, how can the minister claim he's meeting his obligations under the ministerial standards to avoid conflicts between his private financial interest and his ministerial responsibilities? Has the minister learnt nothing from the last time he was a minister?
The Assistant Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his credit of his question. The first thing I'll say is policy responsibility for all things in the Australian campaign reside with the Minister for Industry, not with me as the Assistant Treasurer.
Member for McMahon.
Secondly, I have put all of my assets in the blind trust.
The Assistant Treasurer will pause for a second. The member for Hotham will leave under 94A. And I want to listen to the Assistant Treasurer without interjection. The Assistant Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll reiterate the Industry Minister has policy responsibility for the Australian-made campaign and all issues dealing with this particular matter, firstly. Secondly, when it comes to my pecuniary interests, A, they are all updated. 2, they've all been blind trusted, so I have no responsibility in assets in that regard.
The member for Bonner has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence and...
Sorry, I've just got out of order here. The member for Mayo.
Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister, for several years my electorate has been promised an upgrade to the south-eastern freeway between the towns of Crafers and Stirling. As you know, Minister, this is a federal road. In particular, there was a promise to extend the slip lane on the freeway exits that connect the two towns to create an effective third lane. This stretch regularly sees crashes due to the short ramps. I've met with the State Minister for Transport, Stephen Knoll, on the matter, and the Minister also recognises the importance of the upgrade. Deputy Prime Minister, when will these promised upgrades be completed?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mayo for her interest in the south-eastern freeway between the towns of Crafers and Stirling, acknowledging that they are in her electorate and acknowledging that they're important towns. They have a role and responsibility, the people in those towns, to help build productivity, and they want to get home sooner and safer, just like all South...
Member for Bruce.
I mean, if it's boring for you, it's certainly not boring for the member for Mayo's residents. It's certainly not boring for them. And our $75 million, it might be irresponsible. It is irresponsible of you. There are people in Australia who want to know about our infrastructure.
Deputy Prime Minister, resume his seat. The member for Bruce will leave under 94A. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
We are building, we are creating, we are delivering. Now, we understand the importance of getting people home. We understand about getting people home sooner and safer, Mr Speaker. Now, the South Australian Government is currently finalising the scope of this project that the member for Mayo asked about. Once it's concluded, project timeframes will be available and we can get on with the job and we can get on and build it. Because that's what we do. That's what we do. The Morrison-Marshall governments, working in tandem with each other, we get on with the job and we build things. With increasing demand on commuter and freight traffic, the south-eastern freeway between Crafers and Stirling is being affected with increased traffic at peak periods. And we acknowledge the fact that there are congestion issues. We acknowledge that there are safety issues, and that's why we want to get on with the job of doing those sorts of things, not only in the member for Mayor's electorate, Mr Speaker, but indeed all electorates right around the nation. Now, Cravis has a population of 2,000. I acknowledge that Stirling's population in the Adelaide Hills is about 3,000. They want things to be built, and that's what we are doing. We're getting on with the job of doing just that. The South Eastern Freeway is the most direct corridor between Adelaide and Melbourne, as well as providing a vital link in moving freight between eastern and central Australia, and we acknowledge that the freight task is going to double over the next 20 years. And Mayo is an important part in that freight task. And I know the member has raised the matter with, you mentioned, Stephen Knoll, who's the Minister for Transport, Infrastructure, Local Government and the Minister for Planning. He's a good minister. It's an important issue and it's an important project. I acknowledge that. I know Minister Knoll acknowledges that as well. And the planning is important. It's critical. And working with the Marshall State Government, we expect to see this project commence and also be completed in 2019. That's next year. That's because we get things done. Now, I tell you what does threaten those sorts of things if a Labor government gets in, because there are going to be a lot of things that they are going to rip up. Just like the Andrews government when they ripped up $1 billion worth of East-West Link money. That's right. That's what they did. That's what Labor does. They just rip contracts up. They just rip contracts up with not a metre of bitumen being laid. That's what Labor's. That's all they're good for.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for McEwen. The member for McMahon.
Mr Speaker, my question's to the Prime Minister.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. That's my fault. It's the member for Bonner. He was up before. Okay. You know, we're doing what we always do with the independents. Okay, it's the member for Bonner. There's the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister update the House on how a strong economy enables the government to create jobs and opportunities for small and medium enterprises in the defence industry through exports? How would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this action at risk?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. I can see members of the Labor Party getting a bit excited, no doubt looking for some inspiration on defence policy, and you can understand why, because Labor's track record on defence industry policy is pretty average. Last time, of course, Labor was in power, those on this side know we've commenced and actually commissioned 55 vessels. When Labor was in government for 6 years, how many do you think they commissioned? 55, 50, 40, 30? Labor's track record? Zero. Zero vessels commissioned. But I want to speak, Mr Speaker, about the member for Bonner, and in particular the way in which the coalition, the Liberal and National Government, are backing in Australia's small to medium businesses around defence industry. Because the fact is, Mr Speaker, that the member for Bonner has in his electorate a business called Fairer Engineering. Now, it's just one example of how Australian defence industry is benefiting from this government's investment in the defence export strategy and defence industry more generally. In fact, Fairer Engineering in his electorate has now won about 1/10 of all of the contracts, of the Australian contracts in the global F-35 program. And it's through the support of the Liberal National Government that businesses like Fairer Engineering have been able to grow, have been able to invest with certainty and to create more Australian jobs, because we are making it easier, and we're determined and resolute to make sure that Australian companies can access global supply chains so that they can grow their businesses and grow employment. And that's why we created the Defence Export Facility, to give Australian businesses access to export finance to ensure they're more competitive. And it's also the reason why we put in place the Defence Export Strategy, which is delivering results. And as the member for Defence said, at $3.2 billion, Australian defence exports in just the last quarter was higher than the previous 2 years combined. Now, that doesn't happen by accident. That's a result of deliberate policy design, and it's about government backing in, through taxpayers' funds, the support that industry needs. But it's very different to Labor's approach. It's very different indeed to Labor's approach. The Shadow Minister for Defence spoke recently at an event where he was asked what is Labor's policy when it comes to defence industry. And to actually quote him, he said, "Well, I'm not really sure. It's a profound and deep decision the nation needs to make, and we haven't made it yet." So in other words, with 6 months to go, the Australian Labor Party don't even have a policy on defence industry. For the 25,000 Australians that are employed in the defence industry space, for those who are relying on the fact that the Liberal and National Government commissioned 55 vessels, and for those who remember Labor's track record of reducing spending down to a miserly 1.56% of GDP, they know that Labor will be a...
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the Assistant Treasurer attended an LNP event with the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman and Independent Statutory Officer? Was that appropriate and in keeping with the statement of ministerial standards?
The members on my left, the Prime Minister has the
I'm happy to take the question on notice and report back to the Parliament.
The member for Leichhardt. Member for Leichhardt has the call.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left, trying to hear the member for Leichhardt. Member for Leichhardt.
My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister update the House on how a strong economy enables the government to deliver record school funding to Australian students, parents and teachers? How would a weaker economy through higher taxes put this action at risk?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question, because he understands how important it is that we invest in schools, and I thank him for his question. And I'm pleased to inform him and the House that the government is providing record levels of funding for Australian schools. Commonwealth funding for state schools was $6.8 billion last year. It'll be $7.3 billion this year. It will be $7.9 billion next year, and it will be $8.6 billion the year after, going up and up and up. Commonwealth funding for Catholic schools was $6.3 billion last year. It will be $6.6 billion this year. It will be $6.9 billion next year, and it will be $7.3 billion the year after that, going up and up and up. And Commonwealth funding for independent schools was $4.4 billion last year. It will be $4.7 billion this year. It will be $5.1 billion next year, and it will be $5.5 billion the year after, going up and up and up. From 2017 to 2027, Commonwealth funding to state schools will grow by 86%. Now, very important, and I'm sure the House will be very interested in this. According to the Productivity Commission, since 2006, on a per-student basis, Commonwealth funding to state schools has increased by 78.5%. This is compared to 7.7% increase in the contribution from state and territory governments. We are doing our bit when it comes to funding state schools. All up, the government is providing nearly $310 billion between 2018 and 2029 to all schools. Now, how are we able to do this? We're able to do this because we have created a strong economy. 1.1 million jobs since we came to office have been created. Now, there's two important things that does. Increased tax receipts, so we can make sure that we can pay for it. The second part is that it means that our welfare payments are less. And as a matter of fact, our welfare payments are at their lowest levels they've been since the last 30 years. That is what we've been able to achieve. Now, what would put this at risk? What would put this at risk? Those opposite, because what they want to do is they want to hit the Australian economy with $200 billion worth of taxes. What would that do to the Australian economy? That would stifle the Australian economy. That would suffocate the Australian economy. That would lessen economic growth and mean you couldn't pay for record investment like this.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.